So this is my solar setup. I ended up going with about 20 of these panels off of eBay. I used used panels because they're a whole lot cheaper and they still had good output. One thing I do want to mention, they got some snail trails, but that doesn't affect the performance at all. And obviously I built my own array out of treated lumber, used some unconventional fastening methods, which seems to be holding up really well. I've also got some Z flashing here, so I can actually use the underside of this as a dry storage area. Also stuck a gutter on it. We did some rainwater collection early on with that as well. They are 250 watt solar panels. You can pause it to read the specs on them if you're curious. But the way we ended up wiring it is we ran 3 of these in series, and then everything is paralleled together. And I have actually 18 panels here, but 3 of them go directly to a water heater element and aren't involved in my solar power system. Underneath the solar panels is the utility shed where everything is stored. Now this looks really temporary, basically because I put it up in a hurry. I actually want to side it in and probably build a better door, but I wanted to get it functioning immediately as I really didn't have any power here otherwise. Opening it up, here's all our equipment, and I'm going to go over it all individually here. Again, a disclaimer, I'm not totally thrilled with how my wiring looks, but we'll see if it bothers me enough in the future to rewire it and straighten it out. First, we'll start out with why I went below grade with the batteries, and that's pretty much for temperature stability. A little bit of cooling in the summer and stays warmer in the winter naturally. This box is also filled with a lot of ventilation fans, or vents I should say. I do actually have a fan here as well connected to a temperature controller, but that only goes on in the summertime for obvious reasons. It's important to note that my panels are facing south, so this particular building rarely sees any sunlight, and I have airflow, airspace in between here, so it kind of helps it keep cool somewhat naturally. We'll start with the basics here. First, the wiring from the PV panels comes in and it goes into combiner boxes. That's pretty much just a junction box, and I've obviously done it a DIY method. If you want to copy anything I've done, definitely make sure you know what you're doing and understand electronics. If you want to purchase things from a retailer and pay a lot more, that's definitely your choice. It's a free country, as they say. So the very first place it goes after it combines, it runs directly into this fused box. This is actually an air conditioned disconnect, and what that does is basically give me an emergency switch. It's not DC rated, at least not that I'm aware of. However, it functions for my needs, and obviously it's fused. That's important to me, is having a correctly rated fuse to handle this. So we have one side of this going in here, and from there it goes out over to the charge controller, and this is an MPPT charge controller, and it's the only one you should buy. That's just my opinion. But it's really important to have a charge controller that puts out the voltages that it says it puts out, and does it reliably and has a track record of doing so. It's about the nicest way I can say that without dissing any other brands. So, since I have 3 panels in series, usually it enters here at about 100 volts, and what that does is convert the excess voltage to amperage. I'm not going to go into how MPPT controllers work because I don't completely understand it, to be honest with you, but I do know that that's the basic concept. And what ends up happening then is it puts out the charging voltage that's needed, and that goes through the other leg of the AC disconnect here, and that would run straight to the batteries. And obviously losing my words here. Anyway, the black wires all go directly into the charge controller as well, and then go down to the batteries. They don't have to go through this because they are not the positive side. Now for my battery bank, I basically have 8 6-volt batteries here and 8 6-volt batteries here. They are wired in series to make 48 volts, and then the two banks are parallel together. Something to note on the charge controller, if I can find the wire here. I've got this little temperature sensor wire that comes over here, and that actually reads the temperature of my battery bank and adjusts the voltage accordingly for the temperature of it. Now, to talk a little bit about the batteries I chose, these are pretty much made by Crown. Let's see if I can get in on the label here. The reason I went with lead acid over lithium ion and all these other different battery types that the solar companies push like crazy. Everybody thinks these are the worst batteries, and I personally think they're the best batteries. And the biggest reason for that is most people that are doing this and selling those systems, they don't actually live off-grid. They may have an off-grid cabin somewhere that they visit on weekends, or, you know, it may be a grid-tied system. And the flaws with those batteries, their failure rate is actually too high for me. This lead acid has survived the test of time. It works well. The failure rate is almost nothing. You can abuse them or run them low on water, and yeah, that would cause a problem, but that's human error, not random failure rate. Out here, when I totally lose all my electricity and I have a great warranty with them, let's say, and it takes them 2 weeks to get me another one, and I got to unhook it and send it back, and they got to verify it. 2 weeks might be kind. They might they might push it further than that. So for me, redundancy, reliability, all that stuff's very important to me. I do not ever want this system to go down, and that is why I chose lead acid. And really, filling them is pretty easy with one of these devices. It pretty much tops it off regularly. I also choose to manually equalize it with the charge controller, which is basically overcharging the batteries on purpose for a short duration of time, and that will burn off the buildup that's on the plates. I forget all the technical terms, but there's a lot more professional videos out there probably for you to watch, but this is my system, and I know enough to maintain it. So anyway, one of the more important things is if you keep these batteries below 100% for days at a time, that's really what causes the buildup. So you want to equalize more often if that's the case. During the winter time, that's what happens. I try to equalize once a month. In the summertime, I try to equalize maybe twice during the summertime, if that much. Maybe once every 4 months, just because I have so much sun that everything stays topped off almost all the time. Moving on, we have the inverter, which I opted to buy a big fancy inverter. I wanted one that would be bulletproof, or as bulletproof as you can get. And this thing, I believe, is 4,400 watts, or somewhere around 8,000 surge. So it's actually overkill for what I have, but I'd rather overkill and use it lightly than be pushing something to its limit all the time. So we have a double aught wire running from the batteries. This is a fancy thing is a shunt for battery monitoring. So I can monitor my usage and charging rate a whole lot better than most other systems. And obviously you see here I have a fuse before we go up to the inverter. And then this inverter is actually a 220 volt inverter, so it has two legs, just like you would see coming off the pole into your meter into your house. So for out of here I go with my AC 220, and I just wired it to a conventional panel here. And then out of the panel we run these, I chose a 10 gauge wire on my 20 amp circuits because I have 150, right around 150, 175 foot runs. And I do use high draw appliances out there, and I wanted to minimize the voltage drop as much as possible. The other great thing about this inverter is it is also a charger, and so I have this generator, and that plugs directly into the inverter, and I can charge off of it. That pretty much allows me to use my generator to charge the batteries And I do that occasionally in the winter when needed, when they get low enough that I feel like, hey, I should top them off and make sure that they're staying healthy, because I'd rather burn a couple gallons of gas than ruin my battery bank prematurely. I'm really hoping for 10 years out of it. Also, this little Inkbird is the thing I use to monitor the temperatures for me, and I've entertained the idea of plugging in an electric heater to make sure nothing would freeze here. However, we just haven't gotten close to anything freezing down there. In the summertime, we did run the fan a fair amount. The other reason for ventilation, particularly in the wintertime, you can see I have it mostly blocked off, but it's only mostly blocked off. I've still got a gap, I've still got an intake over there. It helps keep it warmer, but there is hydrogen gas generated by these batteries, and it needs to vent because hydrogen gas is flammable. Something else worth noting is I have a ground rod that you can see there, and that is pretty much tied, which is this. If you've made it this far, you probably wonder what this funky multicolor wiring is. I've repurposed old household wiring and run it to all the different things in here and ran it right out to ground it to the ground. Also, each building that these run to has its own grounding rod, so I want everything to be good and grounded. And I've actually grounded the batteries out there as well. Okay, let's talk about the battery monitoring. So basically, this is the Trimetric by Bogart Engineering, and it is the best battery monitor out there. I do have the Magnum Energy battery monitor for my inverter, but it just pales in comparison to what this and the shunt allows it to do. Right now we're bringing in 330-ish watts. I know it says amps, but I reprogrammed it for the watts because watts means a whole lot more to me, or it's easier to translate in my mind. The reason we're bringing in such little when it's actually sunny out is because our batteries are pretty much topped off and the charge controller is in float mode. So we should, we're actually probably really close to 100%, even though it says 98. It probably will reset itself. Now, most battery monitors don't have a percentage indicator, or if they do, it's not accurate. What makes this accurate is you can program the watt hours or amp hours in your of your battery bank into here. And what this does is, during a period of time when it sees a very little power coming in and very little power going out, it's able to then get a handle on the voltage, and based off of the voltage it says, okay, your battery bank is currently this full. Which, that is the best way to tell. If you actually shut everything off, your charging and your usage from your batteries, and you let them rest, you will be able to know how much power you have in your batteries based strictly on the voltage. And that's essentially what this does. However, knowing how much power, or how much power your battery bank can store, what that does is allow you to, it calculates. So this number here is actually the amount coming in and the amount going out, and it's the balance left over. So if I'm pulling a lot, it's just showing you the difference, and so it's calculating the difference that's going in the batteries or the difference that's going out of the batteries, and then it's able to give you a very accurate number. It also has an alarm built in that can let you know, hey, it's gotten, to a certain threshold that you can set. I think I have mine set at 60%. This thing also does a whole lot of other things. It shows you the days since charged. So since it's considered itself charged, we've actually had 6 days essentially, which is pretty typical for wintertime. It goes a while. I don't know if it'll consider itself fully charged by the end of today or not. We'll see. Then we have days since equalized. We're 10 days since our last equalization. Pretty much right on the number apparently. So that's pretty cool. And the amps. This is the actual amps. It used to show watts, but since I switched the amps default indicator to watts, now this is showing the amps at 60 volts. The replaced percentage since last discharge. Now here's part of what gets interesting, and some of you who know a fair amount about electricity will probably know when it's on trickle charge, it's constantly putting in, but that's not actually stored power that will be usable to you. And so knowing that, this thing essentially once you reach 100%, it will sit there at 100%, but this number may be well over 100%. I've actually seen it at 120% already. So it's just this thing pretty much trying to figure out, okay, it's been fully charged, fully topped off, and you're able to look at it and know. Like, I can kind of assume it's fully charged, but I kind of doubt it because this number has not increased beyond the 100%, which obviously we're not there yet. So hopefully that makes sense on how it kind of calculates that out. And really, you can probably get a lot clearer indication on how this works if you go to their website, which is bogartengineering.com, and read their documentation, read it over. It's really good, and it'll give you a good overview and some more details on it. This is just kind of a general idea how it works and why you should have one. Your solar system, no matter how big or small, should have this. This is one of the first things I bought. The first system I had was a temporary system with 200 watts of panels and a tiny little charge controller. And I believe I actually just started with a Deep Cycle Marine battery. So very small. This thing costs about $200. Totally worth every penny because it lets you see what in the world is going on. This thing up here is kind of handy with the information. You get to check out the temperatures, like the battery temperature sensor, and the temperature of the different components inside of it. This has an automatic generator start, which obviously doesn't work for my cheap Chinese generator out there. The only reason I purchased it was the Shure, and that's because it initially tried to pull too much power from my generator and overloaded it and shut the generator off. So I needed some way to control this, and the easiest thing to do was just buy their panel and make it happen. So that's why I ended up purchasing it, but I rarely use it for things other than just checking some temps, and yeah, it's kind of neat sometimes just to have that up there with the voltage. And I do have a 48 volt battery bank. I know it said 60 volts, but that's pretty much what it charges at. It's fluctuating around because the sun's shining, and so it tends to rest just a little over 48 volts, but the charging voltage is actually up there pretty high. So the entire system, let's do a little bit of pricing information. If you've made it this far, you probably want to know how much everything costs. Well, the batteries, I believe, were right around $3,000 at the most expensive part of the system. I really, in hindsight, I say in hindsight, in hindsight, I'd only have 8 batteries, and they'd be larger batteries, and I'd have the same capacity, because I have a lot of batteries. But I initially bought 4 of them for my smaller system, and then I thought, yeah, that I wanted to go with the bigger system, and I wanted to use the same batteries. And since Crown Batteries is so nice to make their products very consistent, I don't mind a couple months later purchasing batteries that are exactly the same and tying them all together. You shouldn't maybe do that with other brands, but I think Crown Batteries are very, very good, and their quality control is very, very good. Anyway, the next most expensive part would have been the inverter at $1,700. With just not wanting this system to go down and be reliable, I wanted the best inverter I could buy, and as far as I know, that's it. Charge controller right around $500. Solar panels were about $1,500. When I say $7,000 for cost of this setup, I'm including everything, wiring, all that stuff. So I'm just mentioning the costs on the bigger items. The rest of it was all filled in with wiring and an AC disconnect, all the lumber to put this together. Obviously, the black plastic was really cheap. That cost will go up as I redo this, probably in the summertime. When it's less cold, I'll go ahead and rebuild this here, because this is just, it's obviously very temporary. I'm just keeping the moisture out. Got me up and running last July so I could work on things like rainwater collection and other things that were very important, because this is all we have to live on out here. So but yeah, it's been working absolutely well for me. Really happy with it. The cost is way less than what you would get from some kind of package deal from a solar company that sells you stuff that you don't always necessarily need, particularly for an off-grid system. They have all these fancy panels, DC relays and breakers and all kinds of stuff. You know, depending what you're doing, you may want some of that stuff, but this system would have easily cost me twice what it would have cost me twice what it did for the same capacity. So, and I built all my cables myself. I bought the ends, bought the tools, all that stuff. Used double aught welding cable wire. So yeah, that's about all I can really think of. Hopefully I didn't miss anything. I'm sure I did. And you'll let me know in the comments and I'll try and reply to it. But yeah, overall, very happy with the system.